opportunities the industry can generate by increasing and improving how we network.
Two or three more people. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we just wait till the boys in blue go past, I think. Well, firstly, a very, very warm welcome to our first of many, I hope, Agrihive event here in the Hub Westminster in London. I know some of you travelled a long distance to get here. We've got people from every corner of the UK here today. Before we sort of progress into the business of the day, I just want to go through a few housekeeping bits and pieces. We're not expecting any fire drills today, so if the fire alarm does go off, we've got a fire exit to our side there, and we've also got another one in the sort of entrance where you came in. The toilets are just over the bridge, past the lifts, so they're easy enough to find. The Wi-Fi code for this building is Hub West 1 with a capital H and a capital W, so Hub West 1. And for all of you out there that are doing social media, the hashtag for Twitter today is hashtag Agrihive. Also, before I go on any further, I've got to pass on a huge thanks really to the team that are behind Agrihive. We didn't quite know what we were embarking on when we took this on, but without this team of people, really, we wouldn't be here today. And they are Heather Wildman down in front of me here, Rob Hitch, stood at the back there, who many of you will know, Neil Wilson, Neil's at the side there, and of course James Walker, the brains behind it all, Mr. Innovation himself, from all the way from Australia. So I've also got to thank at this point our sponsors, because without whom this event wouldn't have happened either. Hugely generous range of sponsors who you'll see going through on the feed later on. Farmers Guardian for being our media partners and providing us with a whole load of publicity over the last few months, and the Impact Hub of Westminster really for providing us with this perfect venue right in the heart of London. So why Agrihive? I've got more than a vested interest in Agrihive. Having been a dairy farmer for 30 years, few in the industry today would have seen more difficult and challenging conditions than we face today. When I started dairy farming 30 odd years ago, leaving my education behind, there was just over 50,000 dairy farmers in the UK. We're down now to about 13,000 dairy farmers. And how long will it be, I suppose, before that number halves again and we're down to 6,000 or 7,000 dairy farmers? Our industry seems to go around in circles, and each time it does, we seem to result in fewer and fewer partaking in the industry. The only option that's been available to us really is to become more efficient or grow your business. But actually, if we continue following that cycle, eventually we end up with a handful of dairy farmers producing all the milk in the country. Anyway, that's enough of the negativity. Today we're seeking new solutions for the industry. We're going to challenge the conventional thinking. We're hopefully going to come up with some new ideas, some new strategies to move the industry forward. This will be hopefully like no other dairy conference you've been to. Hopefully you'll be looking around and you won't recognise the people that are beside you. Today we've got in the audience representatives from the textile industry, from banking and finance, from commodities trading, from the construction industry, from IT and computer gaming. We've got a leading economist. We've got someone from the cosmetics industry. We've got politicians. We should have one or two from the House of Lords. We've got also the Secretary of State popping in sometime during the morning. And we've also got representatives from our own processing and supply industry. We're also doing something a little bit different that one or two of you may not have seen before. This is Kirsty and Johnny from More Than Minutes, and they're going to record basically through graphics and words the sort of the proceedings of the day, the minutes of the day. So that will evolve as we go through the day, and it'll remain a permanent record really of what we're discussing. Now the Agrihive team are delighted that we could secure a really strong lineup of speakers for you today, with a wide range of expertise in all areas really, not just agriculture. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Philippa Hall, known I'm sure to many of you. Philippa has presented the news on Sky and on Channel 5. She's also brought up on a farm in Leicestershire, so she knows all about farming and is really passionate about farming in the countryside. You may also remember Philippa as being a presenter of the Farmers Weekly Farmer Apprentice competition. Philippa will also, as she has already, be carrying out interviews during the day. We have another camera set up somewhere, and Philippa will be interviewing various people, speakers and audience participants throughout the day as a record of what you think of the initiative and what your ideas are for the dairy industry. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Philippa, and she will chair the next session.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Agrihive is a vehicle to tackle global issues in agriculture and generate actionable strategies and ideas. It was founded by Australian farmer and entrepreneur James Walker, who has joined us today. He's over there, already given a wave, I think. Following a visit to the UK early this year, James thought that his Agrihive concept could be applied to the British dairy industry, which had fallen on extremely tough times. He contacted his fellow Nuffield scholar, Robert Craig, who you've just heard from, to see if he would like to work with him on the project. Of course, he said yes. Robert then co-opted Heather Wildman, sitting here at the front, another Nuffield scholar, and farming professionals Rob Hitch and Neil Wilson to work alongside them. And with that, this Agrihive UK Dairy Summit started to take shape. Today's summit is based on the successful model used in Australia, where there are expert speakers and panellists to help work through the issues and head towards some actionable solutions and ideas that we can share with the industry. The key to the event, however, is you and all of the very wide range of knowledge that we have in this room. It was vital to the team that the audience today had a diverse mix of business interests. In particular, that there were people here who had no or just a little connection with the farming sector. On the whole, farmers are very good at sharing data and information with each other. But Agrihive is a little bit different and sees a greater need to connect with business people from outside of the industry to share suggestions and ideas and best practice with each other. Who knows what opportunities the industry can generate by increasing and improving how they network, and today offers a great opportunity to start with this. The bulk of today is based around the Kidworth Dairy Farm case study, which you've all been given via email, and there's also a copy, I believe, in your presentation packs today. And Neil and Rob will be presenting this case study in more detail later on. This example is typical of many vulnerable businesses in the dairy sector today. Most, if not all, dairy farmers will be able to relate to many parts of the case study, and I know there were some bits which were familiar to me and our dairy farm in the Midlands. It means that any of the ideas and solutions that we generate today can be adapted to fit the majority of dairy farming businesses. Today, we also face the increasingly harsh realities of operating in the global dairy markets. Hearing some very difficult but honest reflections on where it's felt farmers and the related industry need to be to survive in the long term is what we'll be doing today. And indeed, we're most likely to cover some points that the industry representatives here today may even find uncomfortable to talk about. So with the global dairy market in mind and how it's influencing the UK today, let's welcome independent dairy analyst and journalist, Chris Walkland.
Thank you very much for that. Good luck for the day to all of the Agrihive team. It's on there. It's not on here. The one? No, that's the one. There it is. Got it. Okay. So, just to do a bit of a brief background on me. I'm going to take my stopwatch off. I've been a journalist in the industry for about 20 years now. I only write about things with legs at each corner and not with wheels. Write for the major magazines, dairy magazines, occasionally for the grocer, and do a market report every 2 weeks for the Provision Trade Federation and some individual dairy companies. So, what I'm going to talk about is milk production, the UK market, the global market, prices, and my thoughts on where we are going wrong. And I need some IT because I'm not getting that on here, please. I can see that, but this isn't changing.
Sorry.
Now, okay, so that's what I'm going to talk about. I've got a few slides, so I've got to rattle through them fairly quickly. First of all, I'm going to talk about milk production. That's the amount of milk we normally produce during the year. And it's gone from October to December because basically the Great Milk Rush started in October 2013. And I'm going to show you how much extra milk we've produced. That's what we normally produce. That's what we've produced over the last 2 years. The red line being the latest. I'm going to take you back to April this year now. The milk we have produced since April, compared to the long-term average, is 732 million litres. That's equivalent to 3.5 million litres a day, 125 reload tankers a day, 25,000 tankers in total, which would stretch from London to Liverpool. If we include Ireland, there's 1.5 billion litres more since April. There's 50,000 tankers, 450 miles worth of tankers if you queued them up, and they'd go to Dundee from London. And if everybody in the UK had to eat the amount of milk we have produced, based on a consumption of 200 litres per person per year, we'd need 7.5 million people since April for the production from April, a 12% increase in our population, and for the year as a whole, we would need as many people as we're going to get in 2040, and we need them now. That's if we're going to munch our way through all the extra milk that we've produced. On top of what we produce, remember, there's the imports, and we import the equivalent of about 260 million litres. So where are we as far as the UK market is concerned? I'm not going to go into detail about the Battle of the Bottle and the price wars. We know where we are. We know we are a price political football with the retailers, and we know that that has a significant effect on the farm gate prices. I don't buy into the idea or the theory that there is no connection between the retail price of milk and the farm gate price. As far as I'm concerned, the more money there is at the top end of the supply chain, the more has a chance of coming out of the bottom end to farmers. So where are we on prices? I hope you can see the scale on the back. Jan 11 to September, cream and butter were basically pretty near the bottom. Cheese, we are at the bottom. In terms of where we need to be, and by that I mean for farmers to get a 28 to a 30 pence milk price, we're about 60 to 70% of where we need to be. But getting from there to that 28 to 30p is a huge, monumental challenge. I'm going to specifically talk about cheese now. Every manufacturer is making a lot of cheese in the UK and Ireland. We're importing 9,000 tonnes of cheese a month, equivalent to nearly 1 billion litres. Currency's helping, but there's no change in consumption. And we're exporting about 400 million litres. And at this point, everybody's going to say, oh, the bloody Irish, they're making all this cheese and they're bringing it over here. That's the average cheese imports over time, and there isn't really much change. So, Jack, I'm going to stick up for you. That's good, isn't it? Cheese sales are going up. Fantastic. Look at the price, though. That's why they're going up, because the cheese price is coming down. And farmers bemoan the fact that there's cheese on discount in the retailers all the time, and everybody hates to see it. But if it wasn't on discount, we'd have an even bigger problem than we've got. It has to be sold, and the only way of selling it when chicken and rival protein is so cheap is to discount. So the recovery. That's what everybody wants. That's what you're going to get. A real bag of wool. And why? Demand is supposed to be 2% a year, year on year. According to the experts at the EDA, European Dairy Association conference 3 weeks ago, is 1.7% and slowing. That's pretty rubbish. Milk supply, the EU is growing, the US is growing, New Zealand was growing. People think it's going to be down this coming milk year, maybe significantly. They are culling heavily, but what if they're not going to be down? And to depict it all, this is where I am going to blame you, Jack, that's what the countries are doing. Producing one heck of a lot more milk at a time when demand is crap. So, in rough terms, we produce about 622 million tons of milk in the main producing countries. Not much of that is traded. And if the EU grows its milk production by 2%, say, it's 3 million tons, but the domestic EU market is saturated, it has to be exported. Thus, we have to be competitive with the likes of New Zealand, US, Australia, whoever dumps product on the market, which is why we are affected by the global market. So, what drives this global market that everybody talks about? And it's Jack Nicholson. It's fear, it's nerves, it's panic. Right? When the price soared a couple of years ago, it's because everybody was concerned about the drought in New Zealand. Now, nobody gives a monkeys. There's loads of stocks about. All the buyers are relaxed. They know that if New Zealand gets a bit tight on supply, there's plenty in the EU, there's plenty in the US. There's loads of product around. So, everybody familiar with the global dairy trade? Anybody not? Okay, so there are the prices. Continually gone down since January 14, with a bit of a break earlier this year. Again, because the traders thought New Zealand was drying up and there was going to be a shortage of product. Fonterra then pulled product off the market, did a bit of jiggery-pokery with their volumes, prices went up. Now it's come back down again. So where is the auction? Where are those prices in relation to where they need to be? And there, whole milk powder is about 3/4 of the way where it needs to be for farmers to get that 28 to 30p price. Skim milk powder, 60%. Now, the next slide I'm going to put up, there's a heap of figures. I want you to ignore all the figures. There they are. The auction prices at the bottom are the latest auction. The one at the top is the auction 2 months ago. And coming across are the forward prices for the next 6 months. And I'm going to show you how they've changed. Okay, so auction at the bottom, auction at the top, forward prices. This is when things are crap. Sea of red. This is when things are good, obviously. The figures are actually $100 difference between the auction now and the auction a month ago. So $100 up green, $100 down red, yellow somewhere in the middle. The latest auction at the bottom is that. So a bit of a mixed bag. However, still crap. And I'll tell you why it's crap, because that's the equivalent milk price. 20p. Was about 9p, I think, at one stage. But it's now 20p. And if farmers need 28p, got a long way to go. So how does our price compare over time with the GDT? And there's the slide. There is a relationship. So where are we now? The last auction was down 3%. The next auction is today. And if we get 2 declines, the traders' sentiment will again drop significantly. Buyers are not worried about the price at all, because there's plenty of milk about. As far as the UK is concerned, and farmers may have to correct me on here because I don't really know, to be honest, that forage is good. Don't know anything about the maize forage at the moment, but I think that forage is good. We've got plenty of product in store, and the flush, relatively speaking, isn't that far away. I know we're in November and the flush is April, but if we started to empty those stocks now, by the time we've eaten away at them, it'll be time for the flush again, and we'll start building them up again. So how is all of that and that sentiment affecting things? These are the future. Is this working? These are the futures These are the futures prices from. Hang on. These are the futures. These are the futures prices from mid-September to mid-October. Again, green is good, and there is some positivity in the market, especially if you look at, say, January, butter increased 262, 265. This is what's happened since then. Not good. If we look at the New Zealand Southern Hemisphere futures, that's what it was. It was all looking pretty good. Now look at it. Pretty bad. So, milk prices. Anybody seen that slide before? That's what I think it represents. Sure glad the hole isn't at our end. So what we have in the UK market is we have the princes and the paupers, the aligned pools, the non-aligned pools. And I'm going to show you the difference. Those are the average aligned prices. Nobody could argue with that. There is very little volatility in there, and everybody can live with that trend line. Non-aligned. And do you know how much the aligned farmers have had over the last 5 years? That's what the aligned pools, according to my calculations, have netted. And 400 million of that 500 million has gone to 15 to 18% of farmers. So, what have we got as a result of that? Who remembers that? I look down on him because I'm an aligned producer. And I look down on him because he's first milk or out of contract. Silly Berks. I look up to him because I'm a normal, non-aligned Arla, Muller, meadow farmer. But I look down on him. I don't think we can build an industry where we've got that. And there's a vicious circle happening with these aligned farmers. The very high prices that the aligned farmers are getting stimulates their expansion. More milk, more and more milk, which lowers the price for the non-aligned. They're having to sell their assets and their best cows, which are being bought by people on the aligned contracts to produce yet more milk, which reduces the price for the non-aligned, and so we go round. And I think we've got a morality issue in the industry, because I'm not saying that the retailers have to save the industry, but you've got some retailers who pay a brilliant price for their liquid milk, they pay a brilliant price for their mature cheese, their mild cheese, they don't get a very good price. There's another vicious circle too. A surplus of low product prices reduces the milk price. Farmers react because they don't like farming incomes by producing more milk. More milk comes onto the market. It's turned into low value products, which are stored because there's no market, which reduces the milk price, and so we go round again. But are farmers actually getting a fair price? Now, I don't know whether this is a fair and reasonable way of determining that. I'll throw it open to people for debate. But what I've done is I've taken the average of all of the formulas, the indexes, the cost of production prices that are relevant to the UK. So I've taken the EU global price as measured by Arla, or newer, the Irish Dairy Board, as was, price index, and converted it into pence a litre. I've taken the Ulster Farmers Union price to reflect what happens in Northern Ireland. I've taken the Scottish NFU's formula price that they don't talk about anymore, but I do. Sorry. I've taken the liquid contracts, formula contracts from Dairy Crest, and which was Muller-Wiseman, which is now defunct, I think. The cost of production, AMPI, which represents butter and powder, and cheese. And the line you get is that. So if you average all of those out, that's what I would expect the farm gate price to be. And it's that. It's pretty close. Is it a fair way of reflecting fair price? One to debate. So where are the processors? Well, they're under the cosh. They're losing money. They've got challenges. There's rescue bids. There's failures. Cricketer being the latest. But they are investing. They're rationalising. They're exporting. They're innovating. They're communicating with consumers. Arla are doing it. Muller are going to be doing it at the Olympics. Fair play to them. They are on the same side. I think they're pretty well placed for the future in terms of the investment in the processing and the calibre of the processing that they have. Yep, they're getting beaten up by the retailers, but we all know that. But they do struggle at peak milk. We don't have sufficient capacity in the spring. And yet more farmers are producing more milk in the spring. Fortunately, we can ship a lot of it to Ireland. So there's another brownie point for you, Jack. Price indications. Where are we going on price? What do I think is going to happen? If we take the GDT forward contracts prices, if we take the northern and southern hemisphere prices, futures prices, We take an estimation of cheese forward prices, because I don't think they're going to go anywhere anytime soon, and whey forward prices, and apply them to a UK situation. I think this is the likely trend line to April next year for the next 6 months. So if you're expecting me to say things are going to get better anytime soon, I'm sorry, on the best available data I can find in the marketplace, they're not. And the other thing I'm going to draw your attention to is your local garage. Not that's for anything that's in the chiller cabinet, but the relationship between the milk price and the oil price. And there it is. Again, a trend line. And basically that's because the oil countries can buy dairy products, but when their income is down because the oil price is down, they don't buy as much, or they don't want to spend so much on it. So, conclusions. Production is out of kilter with demand. The market is rubbish and will remain so for a while. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. But I think that there will be some surprises in the Tesco review. I've had a bit of a briefing on it already. So I think there are some surprises coming there. Milk prices fair and reasonable? Maybe. The retail price war and global markets are wreaking havoc. No quick turnaround. And one of my main messages today from the production side of the industry, we are production driven. We are not consumer focused. We are obsessed with production, not about consumers. So, my thoughts on where we're going wrong. Our home market is the most important home market we have got. And we are letting these interlopers come in, like Ponzi soya, almond, coconut, rice milk, and taking our high ground. The free-from ranges in the supermarkets are positively booming. And we've got huge opportunities for dairy and its naturalness and all that it entails. So why so much focus on export when we are allowing our market here to decay? And my view is if we fought more for our image, maybe the retailers wouldn't use us so much as a punch ball. And there's a coffin. And some might think that now I'm going to say the dairy industry is going to an early grave. Well, I'm not. But I'm going to re-quote what Dr. David Dobbin, chairman of Dairy UK, said at the EDA conference. And he said that the people who consume the most dairy products are the older people. Young people don't and aren't, apart from pizzas, which is why the likes of Glanbia is booming. Our consumers are falling off the perch. We need younger ones. We need to promote our products hard and fast, and we need to go tell them how great dairy is. Thank you very much.
I think it's 10 past. Just gone. Thank you very much, Chris. I know we're very tight for time, so I will, if it's all ready to go, I think just introduce Alan Wilkinson, who's Head of Food and Agriculture at HSBC Bank.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute privilege to be here, and while we wait to set things up, I just want to make 2 or 3 observations. I've been involved in the dairy industry for 30 years as a dairy farmer's son and working through the industry. I'm also conscious that I live next door to quite a lot of steel workers. They work in Redcar. I'll let you think about that as I go through my presentation, because they're not having meetings like this talking about how difficult it is. Theirs is really difficult. So one of the questions I'm going to pose to all of us is, how difficult is it? And is it actually a lot better than we think? I'm also conscious of the pig industry that I worked rather closely with during the late 90s. Now, for those that can't remember the pig industry, our government, bless it, brought in sow stall legislation approximately 13 years earlier than the rest of the EU. This was not EU legislation that nobody else adopted. We adopted it early, and it took that industry down by over 50% in a matter of 2 years. So when we start and think about the dairy industry, I do just want us to think about those two very crystal, very clear differences. My fourth thing that I'm conscious about is where we are. We're in New Zealand House, ladies and gentlemen. I'm especially grateful to my friends in the embassy. I know one or two of them quite well. Thank you, Neil. And I just want to remind people about a result on Saturday. Now, you know they won. Actually, they were always going to win, if you think about it. 4.5 million people getting very focused about a game. Now, a game is a game, not an industry. But one might argue that those people involved in the game take it just as seriously as we do about dairying. Now, why did they win? Well, if you look at the population, we should have got to the semi-finals because we have the third largest population of all the countries that took part in the Rugby World Cup. It should have been a final between the US and France. Bless it. But let's just think about what I've just said. A country with 4.5 million people get really focused about something. Are they doing that about their dairy industry? I wonder. And when you think about what that policeman said after their win, and I'm going to quote verbatim, he happened to be the manager. He said, "A few ordinary blokes played the game quite well." The understatement of the century. He said, "They will look at the glory, they will take the glory, and then very quickly they will start and analyse and find some uncomfortable truths and deal with them." Ladies and gentlemen, guess who's going to win the World Cup next time? And my point being is, if we want to get really serious about dairying, don't you think we've got to be as focused as our international competitors? And don't you think that we need to take it really seriously and find the very best in this industry? And then work out who our competitors are and move forward. I'm going to talk about what the best look like a little bit later in my presentation. But I've been asked this morning, and it's an absolute privilege to hear, to just look back a little bit. Bankers are great at looking back. So guess what? They've asked me to look back a little bit. And I'm going to take you through a little storyline which hopefully helps us understand why we are where we are now. So bear with me. I'm going to look at the changes that have taken place over the last 30 years. I'm going to talk about the Milk Marketing Board. If my grandfather was here, Jack, he would have been jolly delighted it was formed because he was selling milk in Stockton-on-Tees and not getting paid. He had 20 cows. He was considered a big dairy farmer at the time. 1933, we were producing 3.5 billion litres of milk. That was an act of parliament formed by statute, and it lasted 61 years. I'm going to talk about what happened in the Milk Board. His son, my late father, spent all his working life selling milk in the Milk Board. My father's not here to defend himself, but if you asked him who he sold his milk to, he said the Milk Board. Did he know what the consumers were doing? The points that Chris has made, no, he didn't. How can you have an industry that doesn't know what the consumers want? Jack's grandson John's oldest son is stood talking to you now. My brother took on the farm. The one thing I've learned in my 27 years in the bank is you only do things when you think about consumers and customers. We don't always get it right. That's been a typical message in quite a lot of newsprint over the last few years. But I'll tell you here and now, the bank is probably thinking of something while I'm speaking to try and make its customer experience that little bit better. The day we don't think about customers is the day that actually we have less of a business. So the milk board had a time scale that we've heard recently that the milk board should be brought back. Is it long live the king, or is the king dead? Let's move on. I'll cover a little bit more about that in a minute. Why are we seeing all these issues in 2015? Well, I'll go through that a little bit further. What's happened with processing? Have there been some successes? What about the failures? What are the others doing? And how good a fix is this industry at the moment in order to move forward? I've given you a little bit of a hint of where I'm coming from in that already. So, the 1980s. Lots of excessive production, lots of regulation, lots of change in the milk board. Every time the milk board had to do something different, when I worked there, we needed basically an amendment to the 1933 Agriculture Act. And just to remind people, the whole idea of that act was to collect milk, every single litre of milk, wherever it was produced, and at a constant cost. So it did discriminate the larger farm, and it paid no reference to efficiency or the drive for what you would call advancement and commercialism. There was no commercialism whatsoever. The people that were in the board, and there's one or two of them in the room, might say, of course there was. Rubbish, there wasn't. Nothing like we see these days. Then, of course, you know, we heard about milk quotas in 1994. Actually, the Mansholt plan of 1968 in the EU was talking about constraining milk production. So if we're thinking that we need Europe or the government to give us the type of legislation to help us move forward, ladies and gentlemen, they move incredibly slowly. It took a decade and a half for that to happen. So let's start and think how we're going to change this ourselves. Now, one of the things I want to try and bring across in this presentation is just where the milk industry was at the point of the introduction of milk quotas. And you can see there, you know, average of just under 60 cows, around 16 billion litres of milk. But look at the EU difference, quite a variation on that, and a lot smaller farms. By the 1990s, you know, the MMB was really struggling to keep pace with the changing market, the influence of Europe, and of course, those that were involved in the milk industry in the early 90s, we had vesting day virtually 21 years ago as of now. We had a successor co-op called Milkmark, many of you will remember it, and the smaller farmers with the slightly less proportionate volume of milk signed up with that organisation, thinking that actually they needed to remember some of the issues around protection and making sure security of payment took place. But of course, as we know, that became a real differentiator. Only 10 years after the introduction of milk quotas, over 13,000 milk producers had gone from the UK alone. Farm size had started to change, and we were still producing more or less the same amount of milk, noting that quotas had reduced the total by the various cuts that were taking place. Once vesting day had taken place, instead of having one buyer of milk, there were 100 licenses issued. Today, I think there are around 60 licenses that buy milk. And of course, this word farm gate became crucial. This word farm gate became divisive, and those with direct contracts to supply some of the commercial organisations that were buying milk were paying 1 or 2 pence more than the co-ops that were trying to achieve and strive forward as they saw fit. We eventually saw the formation of 3 daughter co-ops, the names of which are on the bottom of my slide. And it's interesting, even from the year 2000, none of those co-ops are in existence now. And they had, to put it mildly, quite a checkered history, from really successful to less than successful by some way. I just want to pause for 1 minute. I've got to pause and let a lady come and speak. She happens to be the Secretary of State in 5 minutes, so I think I can manage that. I just want to put this slide up because one of the last points I want to try and bring across in my presentation is that actually we're feeling the effects of some of the things now in 2015, principally because of the change in legislation and common agricultural policy, actually nearly 10 years ago. I don't want to go through all of this slide, but this basically shows the amount of support that goes into the CAP, and it's in euros. And I just want to point out the really mustard, horrible colour, which shows market intervention. At the time of the introduction of milk quotas, intervention was a key marketplace for milk. So we were basically putting product into store without an end consumer. In fact, that actually was the consumer. By the time we got to the Fischler reform in 2005, there was very little paid in market support. We still have intervention buying, but the price is so low that actually it's market forces that come into play. And that's one of the things that is hitting hard now, if that's the view you wish to take. I'm going to stop here, ladies and gentlemen. Don't worry, I'm not going away because there's more to finish off, and I'm going to bow to the Secretary of State. That's a first.
I'll just take that. Thank you, Alan. Please welcome the Right Honourable Elizabeth Truss MP and Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Do you want to hold this or shall I put it in here?
Put it in there, that's great. Hello everybody, fantastic to be here. What a brilliant initiative. I met Robert Craig for the first time at the Farmers Weekly Awards last year and saw the innovative work he's doing on his farm. And it's also great to see this year's winners, Pete and Di Wastenage, also in the audience today, because we do have some of the most exciting and inventive people in our food and farming industry in this country. And one of the things we're doing is tonight we're launching Great British Food, which is a new campaign celebrating those pioneers, but also talking about how we can get the message out about how exciting British food is, how exciting British farming is, and what we are doing here in our industry to make sure that we can compete internationally, as well as make sure we're buying, selling, and growing more British food here in our own country. And you know, there's been a lot of work in the dairy area. I know there are a lot of exciting innovations. Only a couple of weeks ago, when I announced the extension of the Yorkshire Dales National Park, I visited the Wensleydale Creamery. And I think it's a brilliant example of a business which operates within a national park. It succeeded in expanding. It does a very good job with local farmers. So they are supplying the milk to the dairy. It also promotes itself as a visitor attraction, and it's attracting increasing visitors in the Yorkshire Dales. But this business is now, in fact, I first came across the people from Wensleydale in Paris when they were at the CL Trade Fair, and their stand was being mobbed by Japanese buyers wanting to buy into that unique product from Yorkshire. It's a protected product. And I think success stories like Wensleydale, who've now launched their first yoghurt product, it's called Yorkshire Yoghurt, spelled Y-O-G-U-R-T. It's spelled called Yorkshire Yoghurt. Show what can happen and where dairy businesses can succeed in the future. I've said before, at the moment, we've got a big opportunity on products. We still import the majority of our butter and our cheese. We import 40,000 tonnes of cheddar every year, which after all is a British product, kicked off here in the UK. So I think there are opportunities. Of course, we know that many farmers are struggling at the moment, and we've worked hard at a European level to secure that additional funding, which will be paid in December. And we're also making sure that the BPS payments go out on time, which I know many farmers are concerned about. But what we also need to do, whilst making sure we retain the strength of our industry in the short term, is building up those longer term opportunities. So we're looking at the grocery trade adjudicator now at a European level to reflect the nature of the food chain and the way it goes beyond national boundaries. We're looking at futures markets in dairy to help farmers plan for the future. And we're consulting on tax averaging over 5 years to help farmers maintain those long-term businesses. We're also very focused on exports, and we've seen a 60% increase in dairy exports since 2009. I think there are many more opportunities out there. I've highlighted Wensleydale, but we've got a whole host of dairy companies coming with us next week on our visit to China, on our trade mission to China. So there are lots of opportunities. But I think an event like this, Agrihive, that really involves the leaders of the industry and those working with the industry is really important to get those ideas out there, to look at the pioneering efforts across British dairy, because I'm absolutely clear that dairy is a core part of our food and farming industry. You know, we need to not just maintain it for the long term, but also help build up the industry. And I think it is the pioneers, it's the people with ideas, with new ways of doing things, to make sure that we can maintain our productivity, our competitiveness, and really win in those international markets is really important. Of course, the government is a very big procurer of food. And last year we launched the Bonfield Report, which is all about making it easier for public sector bodies like schools and hospitals to buy British food. So they can now look at things like where it's from, is it local? They can look at the quality of the product rather than just going on the price. And that is having an impact. We are seeing more British dairy bought across the public sector. And I want to see more progress on that in the next few years. So we're setting an example in government. I think there's more we can do across the country to support our dairy industry, and we are in discussions with supermarkets as well about that. But also, the industry has a major role to play in putting itself forward, in grasping those potential opportunities, both here and overseas. But thank you very much for having me along today. It's a great innovation, and I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, where was I? Back to my slide. If you remember, I was talking about market intervention, and I was talking about that horrible mustard coloured on there. Yes, there is some market intervention. Yes, it does come in, and you've heard a little bit from the Minister say in terms of how that works now, but it is now such at a low level that we are seeing the true impact of global forces and global markets. I'm going to talk a lot more about those in a minute to pick up on some of the things that Chris said. But just to also point out that UK agriculture during the current regime of sort of CAP implementation is probably going to receive 2.88 billion per annum over the next 5 years, and that's not insubstantial. And in terms of, you know, our own milk producers, that's probably between 1 and 2p per litre per annum. So it's not insignificant completely, but likewise it's not the main differentiator between you know, absolute profitability at this point in time. I did mention that you know, there was quite a change taking place, and I think this started to accelerate in the early 2000s. Not only from the point of view that we had you know, a massive and quite horrible outbreak of foot and mouth disease. I'll never forget it, and I know 1 or 2 people in the room won't either. And that gave many people not only the chance through, if you like, ill fate to restock and think about where they wanted to take their own businesses, but I think it also gave the industry a bit of a shock to start and think about, well, where was it going and how was it moving? And of course, we had things like the Curry Commission, which started to think about, how agriculture could move forward. We also had during that time, and Chris has mentioned it, the evolution of a much more robust, milk processing industry. That there was several mergers and acquisitions that were taking place at that time, and the milk market became and started to look a lot more global than it was, or at least it seemed to, as this dairy farmer's son saw it through the 80s and the 90s. And that's something that's really picked up pace. By the year 2005, and I'm sorry I couldn't find this exactly in exactly the direct comparison with my earlier numbers, but we were still producing around 14 billion litres of milk. That we were under quota, but that was limited by that. It was only on 21,000 farms by now. And as you can see, cow numbers and yield were starting to change. But just look at our European colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Not only the 15 member states that we were part of up to that point, far smaller herds. It was probably only Denmark that had larger dairy herds than anywhere else in Europe than ourselves. But then, of course, we went and acquired, 10 further member states. And just look at the stats there. Their average herd size was 4.5 cows. So we are talking about a completely different metric to even where dairy farming had started in the UK when milk quotas came in. And I actually think that during that decade, markets became truly global, and we saw the evolution of some, truly amazing companies, and I've had the privilege of working with them internationally. Not only in Ireland, not only in Holland, Denmark, and of course I can't forget that global giant that's in New Zealand. Going back to where I'm stood now, and those businesses are, in my book, some of the best run businesses I've ever had anything to do with. Their management and their approach and their focus and their determination. Going back to what I said about a certain coach of a rugby union team, the similarities are just so similar. And of course, matters evolved a little bit further. One little thing that I do just want to mention, and I'm sure you'll talk about it in the case study this afternoon, is, well, how many dairy farmers should we have? And do we have a right that dairy farmers should stay and exist and be there forever, and dare I say, even suggest they're put in a museum? Now, by this point in my little story, in the UK, we'd lost over 60% of the dairy farmers that we had at the start of milk quotas, only in the early 80s. And if you go back far enough in the records, and I couldn't find exactly the year, but it was sometime after the establishment of the milk board, we'd have had 100,000 dairy farmers. I think there was about 125,000 when the milk board was established. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that is something that socially you will debate in questions, and it's something that you'll think about, but because the dairy farmer is such a hub of the local community, local employment and everything else. In Europe, with those smaller farms that I've pointed out, most countries, particularly in France and Germany, had lost over 75% of their dairy farmers by the same point in time. So, we were starting to see some material change. And I think the one thing that became apparent to me, and I'm conscious my old boss is in the room, that, and he'd say to me, well, why didn't you realise this earlier, Wilkinson? When you looked at dairy farms, those that were a little more efficient, had slightly lower costs, had slightly bigger farms, had slightly more milk, and got a slightly better milk price, actually, guess what, made a lot more money. And that drive for size really became quite apparent at that point. Actually, when you look back, it had always been the case. But the efficiency and the size and the price of milk really started to drive the difference. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, we had the demise, well, we had the formation, and then we had the demise of dairy farmers of Britain. Now, just to pick up on John and John Allen, we lost money in that co-op. That co-op failed not because it was a co-op, it failed, in my view, in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, because actually it had average at best management. And
And, you know, the type of thing I'm trying to highlight to you is that average management doesn't get you anywhere. Being average is not what gets me out of bed. I try every morning to be the best. I don't always achieve that. But when I see the businesses, and I'm going to talk a little bit towards the end of my presentation about what the best businesses are achieving, then I think that's something that we've got to really start and think about. And that's why I mentioned the Rugby World Cup. They won because they were the best. It wasn't a fluke. They worked at it for 4 years. And those businesses I've touched on internationally are achieving what they're doing because they've been doing it for decades. And if this is the day that we draw the line and start focusing about being the best, then in 10 years' time we'll have an amazing industry, and it'll be one that we'll be really proud of. Of course, and you've heard this from Liz herself, we've seen massive investment in the dairy industry. And one of the reasons why I'm so confident about where we are at the moment is that, in my view, there's been over £250 million invested in dairy processing here in the UK. I would have to go back a long time, up to 2010, to add up the number that came to 250 million. And we know that there's been many, many things that have been, invested, not just with Arla, Muller, but even Dairycrest and people like Wensleydale Creamery. They've done some really exciting things. So we're now in a really strong place. Of course, with the sale of the milk business to Muller Wiseman, we probably have a duopoly of milk processing. But if we think about it, doorstep deliveries were at 40% of liquid milk sales in the mid-1990s. They're barely 3% now. So we've got to think about convenience. Co-op, the retail outlet said that milk was the most convenient product they sold in 1965. In the year 2015, that is still true. So let's get on and live with it. And it's great to hear that we now have more types of cheese than the French. So let's start and think about these things. When I worked in the milk board, there was probably one type of cheese, and it was in plastic blocks like this, and it was called cheddar, and probably quite variable. So the position now, ladies and gentlemen, is one of where we've got global supply exceeding growing global demand. That's why we've got low prices. And until that supply and demand changes, then actually we're going to see the type of environment we've got for a little while. We've got, I do disagree slightly with what the Minister has said. If you look at the last 5 years, we do have a growing deficit in value terms of milk products here in the UK. Now, I'm doing quite a bit of work in the food industry at the moment. In Europe, the UK food industry is the biggest by some distance. The biggest food industry by some distance. We invest more in new products in this country than Germany and France put together. I'm talking to food businesses that have a simple strategy about their international outlook. They want to work here because it's the most sophisticated market in the world, and it's the one that brings most return, and yes, it's the most challenging. They want to work in the US because that's the biggest, and they want to work in China because that's going to be the biggest. Stop. That still involves the UK. So if they're thinking like that, then I think the UK dairy industry needs to as well. I do agree with Chris Walkland. The balance between what the young and the older are consuming is something we need to think about. And as we have falling milk consumption and rising, processed products, that does allow our international competition to sell product here. That's something we shouldn't be fearful of. It's something we should rise to and face on and compete with. I just put up the figures of where we are now in terms of herd size, number of producers. Do I think that we'll ever stop the fall in producers? No, probably we won't. But what we've got to make sure is that those that want to stay in it are the best globally. This is about thinking as a global exporter rather than working out how you compete in the county or in the parish. The competition is abroad, not here. And we now have seen the full fledging of the internationally orientated exporting business. Ask a Dane, ask an Irishman, ask a Kiwi what they do about trading products. They are looking constantly at the international markets. We have a magazine in this country called The Dairy Farmer.
The same thing in New Zealand is called dairy exporter. Clues in the title. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I've given you plenty to think about, but I just want to end on a few things about what I think, as personal views, about what the best businesses do in agriculture. And I make no bones about this. I've studied the sector for nearly 3 decades now, and I think I've had the privilege of seeing some absolutely, truly amazing businesses. They aren't good at one thing, they are good at everything, particularly at sorting out their weaknesses, those inconvenient facts that Steve Hansen talked about. Their management is the differentiator. You can go to a bad farm and see a really good farmer doing a brilliant job. Likewise, you can go to a good farm and see in a virtual mess. It's about the management. Unfortunately, the best farms make the most money. That means they have the lowest costs of operation. That is a key differentiator. There is no excuse for it. Businesses with high costs hardly make any money in the good times and lose the most in the worst times. And it's about making sure you make the most money in the good times, and that's a key resilience for the poorer times. Go and talk to a pig farmer. They will describe that eloquently. They are financially savvy. You're going to talk about that this afternoon. That might be an inbred skill. There are some dairy farmers that are superb at being financially savvy. Others have been trained. Both are right. They build cash in the good times, and they expand and drive their business with cash in mind. They know who their competitor is, and they know what they've got to do next in order to make sure that they remain at least equal to them. And they are relentless about improvement. Now, one thing that Steve Hansen said was that he looked at the Spanish football team, which has won everything in the last 5 years, and they, in effect, lost the plot. And what they stopped doing was focusing it on that relentless activity of seeking out about being the best. They actually, he didn't use the word, but they became comfortable. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be comfortable. Let's make sure that it is really challenging and that we make the most of those challenges. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm, for one, really up for it. Thank you very much. Any questions? No. No? Okay. Any questions? No. Right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I have to dash.
Thank you, Alan. We'll stick to timings and welcome now William Neville, who is Director of Agribusiness from Savills. All on there. Have I got his presentation up?
Very good. Now, that's great, because actually, just tell you that the last time I spoke after a Secretary of State was at Cereals in a I think about 2004. Marianne Fisher-Boel was the EU Commissioner. She spoke, then the Secretary of State spoke, and then I was billed to speak next. I'd prepared endlessly. I had a really, really good talk. And as the Secretary of State finished, she said, "Well, I'm sorry, I must now leave you." And with that, the whole conference centre completely emptied. And I was left speaking to myself. So if you want to leave now, please do go. How are we doing? Yeah, we finished, Alan. Good. There we go. There we finished, Liz. There we are. We can go back. Just there we are. Right. So this conference has billed itself as bringing together leading professionals, business entrepreneurs, and thought leaders. So I'm in front of a very august audience, and the billing went on to say that there'd be an exchange of ideas and the creation of fresh, innovative approaches never heard or seen before. Those are pretty big claims, and I'm going to do my bit, I think very, very much in line with what the two previous speakers have said, with an exchange of ideas, and I'm going to bring to the table and leave you with a checklist to help dairy farmers make the right business decisions. As you can see from the short biographical notes, I'm involved in a wide range of businesses, an export abattoir, a cheese company works quite closely with Wensleydale, Belton cheese, an egg company, a large-scale salad and herb company, and a livestock market. Before that, I was 35 years a lawyer specialising in food and farming. At Burgess Salmon, I saw an incredible wide range of businesses growing or producing almost everything conceivable. And the bad boy in me likes to still giggle about a little scrap I had with a previous Secretary of State gaining the first licence to grow cannabis in the UK, which I then actually passed on the tip to one of my clients that they should apply to grow it. They did apply to grow it, they got the licence, they planted a whole load of it, they went to the Royal Show, and a SWAT team took them down in the middle of the Royal Show because the policeman had driven through their farm and found what he thought was the largest cannabis farm in Europe. So they weren't very grateful for that. To me, what distinguishes the business which can cope with change in a volatile world from one which cannot is relatively simple, at least at a high level. The well-run business will consistently make better decisions and will pull ahead of the business which muddles on, or worse still, makes no decisions at all, and just relies on Farmers for Action or the NFU to produce a magical result from time to time to keep them in business. The conclusion of my talk will be that there are no silver bullets lying around in an unused arsenal, or no magic wands to be waved. My more prosaic proposition is that the way ahead lies in business innovation and running dairy farming businesses better, with the result that dairy farmers will consistently make better decisions. I think that chimes 100% with what Alan just said after he'd finished his slides. He'd sent me his slides previously. I didn't know he was going to encapsulate my talk so conveniently for me. Being fit to succeed in a volatile world is very difficult, and it requires a big change of mindset. And again, I didn't know Alan was going to make all these references to the New Zealand rugby team, but actually I wasn't thinking about what Hens had said. I was thinking about what Johnny Wilkinson said after the match, because I don't know if you saw it, but he said that, because everyone was saying, well, what can England do now? And he said, well, you need to go away and do what I did. I went to New Zealand with England in 19, whenever it was, and we got absolutely thumped. And I saw at that point that the game had changed. The bar had been raised. I thought I was working hard. I thought I was a professional, but I hadn't actually smelt the coffee yet. I realized that there was a whole new world I had to go out there and conquer and work harder, work better, and move on. And I'm sure that that's the situation we're in British dairy farming. 3 of the other businesses I'm involved with do use currency options extensively, and one uses grain futures to reduce risk. I have thought about whether these types of instruments could have beneficial application for mainstream dairy farmers, but I'm struggled to recommend it. There can be no doubt about their relevance for some people, you know, who've been mentioned before, your Dairy Crest, your Arlas, your Royal Foods, and so on. However, for myself, I struggle to see an individual farmer in all but the most exceptional cases using those instruments well. I might go further and actually suggest that for individual dairy farmers to start using them might add risk to their businesses. Now, my next point is delicate, because if you don't get the balance absolutely right, you give the wrong impression in one direction. But it's an important point, and it's just important to get it out there, because I have acted for many hundreds of dairy farmers over many years, been to numerous farmer AGMs and meetings, and I've many friends who are dairy farmers, and I think we all do in this room. And so I think we all understand that there is a lot more to dairy farming than just running a business. It isn't like the proverbial widget-making business on an industrial estate. So nothing I'm going to say belittles or undervalues the importance of understanding what it is to be involved in dairy farming. And I think we understand, all of us, that we're dealing with matters which can be of visceral or even existential importance for the individual. We're talking about lives, futures, ways of life, grandson backwards, as Alan was. However, none of that is an excuse for not running a business well, and nor is it a reason not to constantly ask the right questions. All it does mean is that the answers you get from answering those questions have to be interpreted correctly and set in their wider context. So in short, I'm not advocating throwing the baby out with the bathwater and undervaluing the special things which make dairy farming unique. We must also remember that dairy farmers are small businesses, all of them. They're in rural locations, operating largely in isolation, striving to cope with fast-changing world, where the most important decision, which will really affect their lives, might be taken by the head of the Chinese central bank. That's why I am advocating practical innovation grounded in the realities that a dairy farmer can deal with. So what does a good small business do? Firstly, it recognizes that it is a small business and it can't be good at everything. Secondly, it goes about organizing itself appropriately so as to access services and knowledge that are available either at no cost or at affordable cost. Then, it builds the relationships which it's now got to use those services and knowledge it has acquired in order to make the right business decisions consistently. So pulling all of that together, let's turn to my checklist. And where better to start than the most difficult questions of all? This is the visceral, existential stuff, going to the heart of who a person is, what he or she is trying to achieve in his or her life, and how he or she relates to his or hers nearest and dearest, his or her family. What could be more important than this? But how often do you really hear proper debate round a family table about these topics? The answer, truthful answer, is very occasionally indeed, and I can see some of you nodding. It just doesn't happen enough. And so the challenge I'm throwing out, that's the first challenge. Sorry, touched the wrong button. The challenge is to avoid the mindset of being a victim, but instead realize that within the limits set by the likes of the Chinese central bank, there are numerous choices and numerous things farmers can do to help themselves and make the right choices. Coping with and growing in a volatile world was the task I was set to talk about. Now, that's almost certainly going to involve significant capex over the next 10 years. And that money is probably going to be coming in whole or in part from a bank. But how many dairy farmers communicate meaningfully with their bank? And I've taken the liberty of checking with some bankers and some other and some accountants to check that my opinion on this is correct. And the answer is hardly any. It's just staggering how bad farmers are at communicating and talking with their banks. We have to change that mindset so that banks are treated as partners and co-investors, which it just so happens they are. They need to understand the business of dairy farmers, the ups and downs, and the individual challenges. And I can absolutely guarantee that bankers engage infinitely better with businesses which have addressed the issues which I'm going to cover on this checklist than those which don't. Why? Because it will be a well-informed business with self-awareness, a thought-through business plan, and a tight grip on its own performance. So when the well-managed business turns up to see the bank manager, it won't be, the opening line won't be, so my farm's worth £2.2 million. So what are you fussing about? Just lend me another £100,000. That's going nowhere. So also a word on capex and dairying, because again, dairying faces its unique issues. Collaboration and sharing infrastructure in dairying is difficult for very practical reasons. For arable farmers, it's easy, and well, relatively easy, and it works for both parties. But imagine trying to cope with TB and movement paperwork if you wanted to combine, and two farmers wanted to combine and build a new parlour. It just can't happen. The problems are almost insurmountable in practice. The arable option of sharing grain stores, having a comfortable contract farming agreement with your neighbour, simply don't exist. It's more complex. Then also dairy capex tends to be chunky. It's not small sums of money, quite simply because the things which are needed are themselves chunky, with a lot of concrete and steel. And there's only a tiny minority of dairy farmers who are fully modernised to 2015 standards. I haven't got time to cover expansion through land acquisition itself, but my colleague David Cross is here, and I hope he'll chip in something on land values and capital returns at the end. So, cost of production. I seem to have slipped on a slide. Sorry, I think it's cost of production. Now, this actually is my personal favourite subject. So actually, when I got the case study on the weekend, on Sunday night, I read it, and it was the first thing I rushed to discover. Typically, and amazingly, to my way of thinking, they don't know what their cost of production is, or if they do, they're not telling us in the case study. That does my head in. Worse still, it's so common, I can't bear it. And I know we've talked about cost of production figures a bit today. Chris covered it, and there are Kai, Promar both here. But I worry about the cost of production figures that are talked about and that are raised in this sort of forum. I worry when they're used to negotiate with retailers on aligned contracts, because I worry that we're sending out the wrong messages. Because cost-plus contracts are fine for those who have them, your lucky aligned ones. But those who don't, managing costs is the real issue on an individual basis. And then there's the likely future milk price. You've got to have a grip of that, because that's the figure around which you're going to assemble a budget. Now, Chris has put up some brilliant analysis on all of that, and I agreed with every word he said, except possibly his cost of production figure at 28 to 30 pence. Is that really the right message to be sending out? Now, the DEFRA farm gate price can be quite interesting, was quite interesting 10 years ago, because it was a band of 1.5 pence per litre. But now it's a band of 15 pence per litre, and so the DEFRA farm gate milk price is in fact, I think, probably meaningless. So here is, slightly second time round, an interesting slide. Because that is a Savills client, a real Savills client, and that is the milk price he has actually received over all those years. Now, never mind the detail at all about colours or anything, but we come and share that figure there is 29 pence per litre, and that figure there is 24 pence per litre. So that's 8 years, so 7 to 15. If we're going to have a cost of production figure of 28 to 30, how many years is this farmer going to be making a profit? Sorry, I must come back. You've got the point. Once in a blue moon. This farmer, who's a good farmer, realistically, to be consistently making a profit, he's got to have a grip, got to achieve a cost of production which is significantly lower. So I think realism is the watchword I want to try to get over here. Just going back, this is are you producing? Is the farmer producing what his supplier really wants? Now, again, Savills were asked to do a survey for a medium-sized dairy company because some of the farmers who were supplying them were unhappy with the milk price. So they went and analysed all the milk prices being paid, and what they discovered was that the variance under the same milk contract between the top 10% and the bottom 10% of supplying farmers was a whole 3p. So under exactly the same contract, the farmers who really got it were earning 3p more than the farmers who didn't get it and were just providing the wrong product. I'll just tell you a nice little story as well. I'm one of the businesses I'm involved with is an export lamb abattoir, and I was at a board meeting 2 or 3 weeks ago, and one of the farmer directors sidled up to the managing director and said, "Oh, I've sent you some nice lambs yesterday." And he said, the managing director said, "Yes, you sent some lambs, but they weren't what we wanted." And he said, "Oh, they were nice lambs." And he said, "Yes, but they weren't what we wanted." And they were all about 3 or 4 kilograms too heavy. He'd spent a lot of time producing what he thought were nice lambs, but they just weren't what was required in the marketplace. Result, 50 pence per kilogram reduction in price. A huge amount of loss and a great deal of extra cost in adding the unwanted weight. So it's not just dairy farmers who don't get it. Then there is the dairy farmer himself. Now, every large dairy farmer that I know, without exception, employs European labour and is paying the basic wage of about £7.20. That's how it is, and presumably how it has to be to keep the cost of production down. Now, I'm sure one of the issues which will arise later, is going to be whether John thinks milking his cows at £7.20 per hour is the best use of his time. And in fact, I think when you delve into it, you may find that his actual remuneration of what he's paying himself is actually going to prove to be slightly less at £6 per hour. Then, the subject of the milk purchaser. There is so much to be said about this, but the consolidation in processing over the last 20 years has been extraordinary. We're not yet on a par with the sugar industry. Alan's referred to the pig industry. I'm going to refer to the sugar industry. But we're definitely heading in the same direction. With sugar, it's simple. You can only get a contract to supply sugar if your farm's in the right location. And frankly, we are seeing signs of that already. There have been signs of that, and the evidence is there that that is coming. And there is also a huge issue, and I'm not going to dwell on it. We all know the sort of issues that arise with failing dairy companies or failed dairy companies, and there's really not enough attention, I would suggest, on the quality of the covenant on which the milk check is founded. And granting your milk purchaser extended credit, the amount of exposure you're taking on and the risk you're running, again, there needs to be very serious questions addressed if you're going to be fit to survive in a volatile marketplace. One of the more obvious points is about buying inputs, but it's still a huge issue if you're going to survive volatility. The price of hydrocarbons has tumbled, but how many farmers have obtained their share of that gain? I really haven't seen evidence of it. There are massive savings available on electricity and other fertilizers and other products. Then again, the AHDB, I mentioned that. They get a lot of bad press at the moment, I've noticed. But it's actually an amazing, wonderful, free resource. Easily accessible, up to date, and farmers have actually paid for it. But do they use it? Sadly, you know the answer. I checked last week, and less than 30% of dairy farmers are even signed up to receive, let alone read, Forage for Knowledge. Equally appallingly low are the take-ups on the daily, the weekly, and the monthly updates on data for the dairy industry produced by the AHDB. That is shocking for me, and imagine the difference if you were a bank manager on being confronted with a dairy farmer who could start by explaining the state of his industry clearly and simply with the help of the information provided by the AHDB, compared with sitting down with a farmer who's in a muddle and doesn't understand where his industry is at and how he fits into it. We have to change that. Then the last thing I was going to mention really is benchmarking. Everyone talks about it, but only a tiny handful of people do it seriously. The output of a serious benchmarking group is the sharing of knowledge. How did you reduce your electricity bill by £10,000 last year? The answer is asking the right questions and signing a few pieces of paper. How did you use less water? Maybe more technical. How did you manage to spend less on dry cow treatments? Lots of small adjustments and pieces of knowledge emerging from communication, all of which are part of being fit to survive in volatility. My contribution then is to put forward this checklist to help dairy farmers and their families working with their stakeholders to make the right decisions for themselves and to do so consistently. This checklist is deceptive. Answering the questions raised properly does actually mean you have to smell the coffee. You have to see that the bar has been raised, and you have to be voting and taking actions to become the best. I'm sure it's not perfect, and there are some great brains and some great experience in this room, and the checklist can be improved. But it would be a helpful and practical tool to put out to dairy farmers to help them be in control of their own destinies rather than relying on the amazing David Handley and the tireless and dedicated NFU. And on Sunday evening, I road tested my checklist as I read the case study, and I hope you will do so as well. Thank you.
We're going to crack on now with the case study, which is going to be launched by Rob Hitch and also Neil Wilson, part of the Agrihive team. All right, Neil.
Double act.
Right, double act.
Yeah, go on.
Now, Rob, can I trust you to work the technology, because I've been bloody useless at it?
Right, I think broadly we're here to talk a little bit about how we arrived at the case study, what it's meant to do, and some thoughts on it, hopefully to stimulate a bit of discussion later on today. And in terms of doing that, really to talk you through what was the logic behind it, which I think Neil was going to just fill you in on.
Yeah, so I suppose why we're here, previous speakers have certainly covered that very well. Huge pressure on the majority of the sector. But what we really wanted to do was to explore what farmers can do, but by connecting them with those from outside the farm gate to see if there's anything we can learn from those other businesses operating out with the sector, but also whether they can maybe learn anything from what we do, because we're certainly not here to say that that agriculture and farming doesn't know what it's doing. There's some fantastic things and some fantastic innovations going on farm that don't get shared in the wider business circle either. So I think that was the basis of what we were trying to do. And taking on from what James Walker did in Australia, the basis of that was the case study. So Rob, can you just flip on to the next slide? And I think, Rob, you were just going to cover kind of main issues that we're seeing at the moment on farm when you and I go out.
The issue about farm profitability has been raised already this morning. You know, we've seen great swings. We've seen businesses suddenly go from having decent milk prices and reasonable profits. We've got a year where a large proportion of dairy farmers will be probably making substantial losses. And it's how we address that, really, and how farmers can start to look at addressing improving profitability on farm. And I think, you know, it is about trying to get people to think long and hard about where they're at and what we need to do. I think we're seeing quite a lot of issues with succession, which is a big driver on farms, and potentially, you know, you're never quite sure whether profitability or succession is really the problem. You know, time after time, if you've got very profitable businesses, it's generally quite easy to find successors and encourage them to come into it. But if you've got businesses that aren't generating enough profit, then it's much more difficult to find those people to come in and succeed. And that's probably driven by management issues, which is also being discussed by William and other people earlier. You know, whether within the dairy sector and on farms generally, is management of those units up to scratch? You know, we're all aware, and Neil's alluded to some fantastic businesses that work very well, but you know, there's a lot of businesses that probably could do a little bit more. So it's how we improve that. What are the hurdles? What we need to do. So they were the sort of issues that we were looking at in putting the case study together and trying to pull out and sort of put a position forward that would force people to look at them.
You've all had it. I think you all got it at the tail end of last week. There was emails went out. There's another copy in your pack today. So what does the farm actually represent? Well, you know, Rob and I are very privileged to see probably 200-300 farm businesses each every year, and even more privileged that we get to see their inner workings in terms of family dynamics and financial discussions, all predominantly still around the kitchen table, which is great for me, not so good for the belly, unfortunately. And when we look at these things, you know, we start looking at the people in this case. You know, we've got Robert and Heather Kidworth. No idea where we come up with the Robert and Heather from, but that's the original thinking of this group. In our mind, it probably makes a fairly typical family farming unit. Mum and dad working in the business with support from children, but with interesting dynamics around the competition from those children to actually become part of the business. And on what terms are they going to become part of the business? You know, is it just going to be handed to somebody on a plate to just go on and take it through from the next generation as it's always been? What happens in this case where there's 3 children, seems to be a couple of them interested in some way, shape or form, you know, and another child that's maybe away from the farm. But as tends to happen in certainly family farming businesses, Robert and Heather Kidworth will want to be fair, in inverted commas. The big question is, should they be fair? Do they have to be fair? You know, they might want to be, but actually what problems does that give to the next generation coming through with mum and dad going down this route of being fair? Rob, do you want to talk a little bit just about the farm and the finances and how we came to them?
I think broadly we were looking for something that represented most of the businesses that we see, or a large proportion of businesses that we see that we think are probably the ones that need these issues covering. And it's very typical. It's a sort of owner-occupier farm, a couple of 100 acres, 150, 170 cows, as Neil's alluded to, mainly family labour. There's a lot of these businesses kicking about, and they've, you know, probably ticked over quite nicely. We all know, you know, we'll all know several of them as neighbours, as, you know, farms that you drive past. So there's a lot of them about. It's probably a farm that's been driven by use the word tradition, but not probably in a sort of derogatory sense, in that people have strived to expand, pushed on cow numbers a little bit, taken opportunities when lands come up, because, you know, generally that's what's driven farms growing. And that's how it's grown. It's you know, reasonable land, good, you know, reasonable setup, buildings probably dated, still an awful lot of dairy businesses running out of buildings that probably went up in the 70s under an FHDS scheme, which fortunately I'm not old enough to remember. But, you know, there's a lot of those buildings that are probably past the sell-by date, and some of these businesses probably have to think long and hard about where that investment will come from. In terms of the finances, you know, we've used the figures and based the figures around the sort of average numbers that I see in our accountancy practice over the last sort of 7 or 8 years. So they're sort of fairly representative of what we see day to day on average farms. I think the key thing that comes out of it is if you look at the period from sort of 2009-10 through to today, that business hasn't really ever generated any money out of its dairy business. You know, they've ticked over. They've had good years when they've made quite a bit of money, and they've had the odd bad year for whatever reason. 2012-13 was pretty grim for most people because of weather, and 15-16 looks like it'll be pretty grim because of milk prices. But when you look at the year, you know, we're in a volatile market, but if you look after year, pretty much at the start and end of that 7 or 8 year period, the capital that the farmers have from farming is pretty much identical. You know, and we see it making a little bit of profit, but by the time it's lived, had its holiday, a little bit of drawings, paid a bit of a tax bill, it's not actually making any progress. And these are probably the businesses that, you know, we're looking at now and thinking, well, are they going to make the step to go forward, or are they going to actually start to wither on the vine, which we need to, you know, understand, I think. So that's broadly where we were looking at coming from with the case study.
And as you'll have noticed, the business borrows a little bit of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not particularly highly geared. I think as well, you know, from a bank perspective, you know, those are, because they borrow money, the bank will actually see those businesses on a regular basis. But there's around about half of this agricultural industry doesn't actually borrow any money. I sense that, you know, we're getting to a point in some of the sectors, even if they haven't borrowed money in the past, they might be starting to look to do so now, just to keep cash flow going. You know, but from a bank's perspective, I'd be interested to know, you know, from those businesses that sit in credit, the bank probably spend, or certainly spend, a lot less time on them because they don't borrow. And actually some of the input of that's going to be interesting to see as well, because there's probably half of those businesses out there. Maybe speak to Rob once a year to sort out their tax. What other advice are they getting put into that equation? So Rob's put the questions up. You'll all have seen them. And now these questions are really challenges for you. We don't have the answers, although in the bar last night I was pinned by a couple of people to say you must have the answers. We don't. You know, that's why we're all here, and that is why we will be launching the case study as a wider competition. So they're challenges for you, but certainly the Agrihive team are more than happy. In fact, we positively invite your thoughts and feelings on this matter, even if they don't relate necessarily to these questions. You might want to write a little bit. You might want to give us a thesis on it. We are open to everything, because this, for us, is open house. This is, you know, let's get as many ideas out from you guys in the room, but also the guys watching on the live stream. And then when we launch this wider case study, you know, anybody and everybody we can get to talk to. Hey, Rob, you got anything you want to add on the questions? Stuff. Okay, so in terms of the case study competition, open to absolutely everyone. The entire global farming and business communities are invited to take part, and we'll look forward to reading your submissions. And everybody in this room, if you can get as many of your peers and friends and colleagues to look at it and give us some thoughts, that would be fantastic. It'll be made available through the Agrihive website, and also for those that have registered, you will probably get an email if you haven't done so already. There will be one winging its way to you again. And we'll have prizes for the categories that you see on the screen there. The competition will run to the end of January, when we'll then effectively judge and distill the inputs and feedback and come up with a wider feedback to put back out to the industry. Rob?
Yeah, I think broadly in terms of the competition, that's what we would like, as many ideas as we can. And I think, you know, we want to cover some of the issues that we think perhaps aren't talked about too much, or are swept under the carpet a little bit. So in terms of some of the things that we see as maybe stifling businesses and maybe not making farming, and particularly dairy farming as well, not quite as dynamic as some of the other businesses we see, are maybe some of the sort of things that farmers are fighting most to keep, but whether they're there or not. So Neil, I think, had a few views on subsidy payments and reliance.
And I suppose ultimately the starting point for this for me is, you know, our farming professionals and industry representation really doing farmers a disservice with some of the advice that's given and the way that actually drives decision making. You know, and a lot of units I go to, and I'm sure Rob sees the same, and any advisors in the audience, you know, there's a lot of decisions that aren't necessarily commercial, but get made around about trying to keep this thing up here, subsidy. You know, and actually quite a lot of those decisions become relatively non-commercial, just to try and keep this payment. And actually, if you look at the wider, bigger picture for some of these farms, and we've been in some who actually have just said, right, I'm not going to have that payment now. It's actually hindering my commercial activities. But I think as an industry, we are still driven very much by that subsidy payment and what it means to us, without actually having a real good handle on what does it actually do for my individual business. So that distorts certainly a lot of commercial decision making that we see. Rob, I'm going to let you talk about tax because I have no idea about tax.
Yeah, probably shouldn't representing accountants and tax advisors, but you know, we just wonder as well, are there certain things that farmers and probably the industry are perhaps partly complicit in that don't encourage farmers to be quite as dynamic? So, you know, I know at the moment there's pretty much all accountants, lawyers, land agents are advising farmers how to try and ensure that they retain a bit of inheritance tax relief on a house, which inevitably drives people to probably not do things in a purely commercial way. Now, it would be much easier if we didn't have things like that impacting on businesses. Now, whether that means you tax something completely or you don't have any tax doesn't really matter, but it comes back to the same sort of thing as subsidy. We've got certain issues driving businesses or being, you know, people being advised to do things that aren't really driving the commercial dynamism in that industry. So we see a lot of farms being grass-let, dog and sticked to try and protect a few little inheritance tax rules, when realistically, as an industry, we could probably do with all those businesses being farmed. So we need some, I think, you know, in terms of subsidy, as Neil said, whether it's tax, there are issues that broadly are probably hindering the way that farming works in terms of making it dynamic enough, but we're all probably complicit in lobbying to maintain them. So, you know, just where we go with that. And likewise, you know, the whole capital value of farm assets now is a real issue and a drag on the industry. It's very difficult to buy more land. It's very difficult to invest. So it does mean that we perhaps see the status quo maintained. Anyone that's got a lot of capital behind them is quite a nice safe bet from the bank's perspective, presuming they generate some cash. But you know, that the amount of capital that's involved in farms is broadly getting to the point where it makes it difficult to do things quickly, and it's also probably preserving and encouraging people to hang on where perhaps they shouldn't do. So I think we wanted some of these issues to come out of the case study and generate some discussion, and hopefully, you know, whether the industry as a whole should be maybe taking a different view on some of these issues going forward.
I think in that final point, you know, is a bit about the funding, you know, how farms are financed and funded, and how we can look at that. You know, the traditional route clearly has been through banks. Are there some other more non-traditional routes that might be there? And I think we've got a gentleman on the panel this afternoon that might help us out with some of those kind of things, just some different thinking about how we might finance and look at some of these activities.
So I think we've sort of covered a little bit of this morning from Chris and from Alan. I think we've got to get a bit of probably some realism and some common sort of purpose in the industry, I think, more than anything. We're sort of sat in a position where we are all looking at supermarket cost of production prices at 30p, and pretty much every farmer that doesn't have one wishes they did. But there's also the issue that realistically, for a large proportion of what we're producing, which has been alluded to by previous speakers, is that actually going to be competitive? You know, I think, who was it quoted David Dobbin? Somebody did this morning. But he also said the other day that, you know, they would anticipate a standard price or a long-term price for farmers to be working to of about 36 euro cents, which, you know, depending on currency fluctuations, could be anything from 22p or 23p to 30p. So we've got to work out where we do think the industry stands. What should farmers be trying to get the cost to? How are we looking at those prices? What currency are they in? What's the currency risk outside of that for the people that don't have an aligned contract? And I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's important for the industry to come up with those sort of numbers, so farmers that are sat there trying to run their businesses can actually say, if I can't deliver that, I can make decisions, and if I can deliver that, then I know where I stand. But at the moment, we seem to, everybody ducks the issue about what somebody should be aiming for as a cost of production. Farmers on the ground are all trying to get it down, but I think the industry is scared to say where they think that figure should be, and that's probably something that we need to nail our colours to the mast. You know, can we reduce volatility? Don't think anyone's given us an answer this morning. It's here to stay. We will have years when we make losses, and we will have years when we make big profits. As Alan alluded to, if you can pile up cash when it's good, that hopefully brings you through. So we need to really drive this. You know, we've got a lot of people arguing for processing, you know, and there are plenty of people around the UK looking to increase processing capacity or improve processing and modernise it. But you know, one of the issues will be a lot of that processing capacity is going to be into products that potentially won't end up on a UK shelf. So if we're doing that, we're effectively looking to where we can compete. And I just think that if we keep sending a message out to the UK processing sector that we need 30p or 40 euro cents or 42 euro cents to produce milk, there's a danger they won't build any processing capacity in the UK. We need a competitive industry that can deliver in line with what people in Ireland are producing at, so that we can encourage the likes of processors over there to invest here and build our dairy industry as well. So they're the sort of things we need to be shouting about rather than trying to brush under the carpet.
For the Kidworth family, you know, will there be any tools available at the farm gate to help them manage some of this volatility and manage some of the risks? Because at the moment, there's very, very few things available to the farmer to actually help them cope with what's going on. You know, so can we find some of these things, and should the processing industry also be playing a part in this to try and help at the farm gate? And I'd be very interested to hear any views around about, you know, what processors can do with farmers, you know, because we're all part of the same bigger industry, you know, to help manage some of that risk. You know, but equally for farming, as Rob said, you know, to try and drive further investment from processors, I think we do just need to get to the point where, you know, if our Euro competitors can do it comfortably for 35 euro cents, which today is about 24.5 pence, then we need to be able to do that as well. Certainly to cope with those global markets that we get much more involved in. Rob.
Yeah, will any of this be enough? I think William alluded to, you know, he looked through the case study to find out what the cost of production was, and there wasn't a nice big figure saying this is what my cost of production is. I think there's a huge issue in terms of what people understand by cost of production. The supermarket prices at 30p include a little bit of profit element or extra money returns on bits and pieces. But whatever we're doing, many farmers don't understand where they're at. I mean, the case study that we're looking at, you know, there's years in there where the business makes quite good money, but actually, you know, most people that are running smaller farm businesses are running them through partnerships and sole trader businesses. They're taking their drawings and tax out after the bottom line. So when they look at the profit and think that's what they've made, they've forgotten that they've got to then live. And that's a big issue. You know, and we see, you know, I work in a firm of accountants where we often get the question, you know, well, you're telling me I made 50,000 quid, where is it? You know, because I don't have it anywhere. And basically they've spent it. So it's understanding what you need to include in those costs, which I think a lot of people aren't. I think there's a whole multitude of people who talk about costs of production. Probably we could do with a very straightforward industry standard figure that everyone used. I'm not too bothered about imputed figures because people need to know what it costs on their farm, and every farm is different. But we need to let farmers understand what it is and get them to really know where they sit. There is a huge variation. We only have to look at, you know, the Tesco moves alluded to by Chris, and we do have a panel member after who probably knows all about them, but obviously sworn to secrecy or he'll be shot. The there is a big variation. We've got Booths farmers in Lancashire and Cumbria getting 32 or 34p, and yet we've got other people on 14. You know, we've got that massive swing in costs. Booths are saying that Tesco's come up with a cost of production at 30p. We've got clients who last year, if I remember back to our 14 figures, I think we had our best people were probably producing it in the very low 20s down towards 20 pence, and the very worst people were at nearly 40. Now, some of those at nearly 40 have actually gone out of business, and some of them are still here, surprisingly. But there is a massive variation people need to get to. And I think one of the things that we're all perhaps a little bit scared to talk about is potentially where that comes in terms of improving cost of production through economies of scale. And probably the biggest driver of economies of scale is not whether you've got more cows and less feed or a bit less fertilizer or a bit less bank charges. The biggest thing that drives economies of scale that I see is just family drawings against the number of cows they're milking. If you produce 1 million litres of milk and draw £50,000 out, it's 5 pence a litre. If you produce 4 million litres of milk, it's only 1.25 pence per litre. That is a huge issue, and that is what's probably driving most of the cost out of farms, getting scale driven down to one family drawing out of it. And that's something that we need to be honest about and look at and make sure that people understand where they sit and how they are competing.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And another thing I think the case study throws up is back to this land ownership thing we touched on earlier. In the Kidworth case study, we've got this valuable asset that's actually struggling to generate cash. We've got this huge balance sheet net worth that really, well, as Rob said, when you look at the figures actually in cash terms, just going backwards, dying a slow death, I suppose you could say. But it's also going to become a burden when it comes to succession planning as well. So it's not actually helping you make any significant cash. It's going to become a pain when it comes to sorting it out with the next generation. So I suppose the thing is, should we be looking at land ownership in a different way than we do at the moment? Rob, do you have the answer?
I know, it's certainly an issue because people do look at land ownership and the value that's tied up in it and worry about passing it down to generations. But when you actually look at, if you look at the return on land generally, it doesn't generate a lot. Rents have always returned about 2% yield on land. So it's not a huge earner. It provides a lot of benefits which can be held from a capital perspective. But I think we need to, when you look at trading businesses that run well, they can generally generate very good returns on top of that land, which is why tenants sometimes do phenomenally well. And also why we get good businesses that potentially don't necessarily always rush to buy land. We've got to, land's almost a sort of place to hide your money when you've made it, but it's not the way of generating the cash in the first place. But I think we need to get the burden away from treating farms being passed down or people running farms as having to have the land with them. We might end up with a lot more landowners and a lot more landlords if we've got family members who are potentially split farms up and provide equity to people for owning it but not actually running the business. And I think splitting the business from the land potentially makes a lot of that easier. But, we'll listen to views afterwards, hopefully. And I think in terms of doing that, whose job is it to try and get some of this aired? Where do we go? Is it an issue? I can't remember who'd been talking about trying to deal with succession by splitting land and the business a week or two back. It was in one of the papers, but I can't think which, and I couldn't find it when I was looking for it. But it is an issue that probably wants talking about, and as capital values increase, it becomes more and more a big problem in terms of dealing with succession when you've got huge capital values that you're not that keen on dealing with. And the other thing is probably back onto some of the issues that both William and Alan raised earlier. Do we have the right people running businesses? It's very difficult. A lot of these are very small family businesses with 2 or 3 children, and it's often very nice just to let all of them have a share in the business. But quite brutally, we probably need people that are capable of running those businesses. I mean, I act for a couple of partnerships with people in them who probably should never have been partners, and it stifles those businesses in the future. So we need to think a lot more about when we're introducing partners and how we're building businesses. You know, we need how we choose between family and doing that. Do we need to be more focusing on picking successors on merit rather than on age or sex, which seems to be the sort of general historic approach to the equation? And can that bring in outside skills? You know, most of the best businesses I see now, I suppose, are probably run by fairly highly educated people. Most that have been through a higher education qualification, they've come back in the farming. I think what we do need to do is, if we're trying to retain these people in farm businesses, we need to try and drag them back from university when they've gone, and don't let them get too swayed by the bright lights of the city, which is not necessarily an easy task depending on where you live. But you know, it's trying to get enough people of that caliber back into the industry, and it doesn't happen overnight. You know, most of it's probably generational. You can't suddenly turn yourself from being a guy who left school at 14 and never travelled the world or did anything to a world travelling student with a PhD in something. So we want people that have got skills, and we just, you know, should we be really being a bit more brutal about that on farms and trying to ensure that we do have good people running them?
Yeah, actually I think professionals play a big part in that as well. Still, too many farms I go to, you know, son, daughter will be outside working. They're maybe going to be part of the business. They might even be part of the business, but it's still mum and dad that speak to the bank manager, and you really don't get a feel for what's coming behind. You know, ultimately, from a banker's point of view, I lend to the people who run that farm. I don't lend to the farm. I don't lend to the land. I don't lend money to the cows. I lend money to the people. They need to demonstrate to me that they are going to have the long-term skills to pay me my money back without needing to put a for sale sign up, which nobody in this industry wants to do. So, you know, and that brings us on, you know, are management skills good enough? No idea. On far too many farms, you know, I go on, Rob will go on, I have absolutely no idea if the management skills really are good enough. You know, and that just takes time. But it also means that, you know, we need to be supporting farms and farm businesses to get people off, get them away, tour the world, see other businesses, join discussion groups, benchmarking, all of these kind of things, which I think probably still a tiny portion of the industry actually do. So, Rob, I get the feeling it's lunchtime.
Sounds right to me.
Have a wee chat about this. And after lunch, there'll be a chance, you know, if the audience, any in the audience want to ask questions, Rob and I will be here for another 15 minutes. If you've got no interest in asking us any questions, that is great. Jack can start a little bit earlier. Philippa.
Dietary requirements. I don't think there's any dairy-free today, but gluten-free, vegan and everything, then just speak to Robert, who was speaking at the start, and he'll be able to point you in the right direction. But I think we're reconvening at 1:15. Thank you.